The morning light streamed through the blinds of Elena Rodriguez's office, casting golden stripes across the polished wood of her desk. At 42, she was the youngest Latina judge in Denver's judicial system, a title that came with both pride and an unspoken burden. Elena wasn't supposed to be here, at least not according to the statistics and barriers that had stood in her way. Raised in a working-class neighborhood on the south side of the city, her childhood had been defined by hard work and unwavering principles instilled by her parents who had immigrated from Mexico seeking a better life. But it was a single day when she was 12 that truly set her path. Her father, Michael Ramirez, a respected auto mechanic known for his honesty and fair prices, was arrested right in front of their small shop. The charge: theft of auto parts, a crime he never committed. Elena still remembered the cold metal of the bench in that courtroom, the way her small hands had clenched into fists as an overworked public defender barely fought for her father. She remembered the officer who had made the arrest, the smirk on his face, the casual way he had twisted the truth on the stand. 3 months later, the charges were dropped when the real thief confessed, but by then, the damage was done. Their savings gone to legal fees, their reputation in the community tarnished, and something fundamental broken in her father's spirit. The system only works if good people make it work, her father had told her the night after his name was cleared. It wasn't bitterness in his voice, but resolve, a challenge that Elena took to heart. Law school had been brutal. For every professor who recognized her brilliance, there were classmates who whispered she was only there to fill a quota. For every perfect grade, there were doors that remained firmly closed. But Elena had her father's determination. She graduated at the top of her class, passed the bar with distinction, and built a reputation as an attorney who was meticulous, ethical, and utterly relentless when it came to justice. When she was appointed to the bench at 38, the local paper called her Denver's most promising judicial appointment in a generation. Others called her too young, too idealistic, too outspoken. Elena had learned to tune out both the praise and criticism. She wasn't here for accolades or approval. She was here to make the system work the way it was supposed to, fairly, without bias, and with accountability for everyone, regardless of their position or power. What she didn't know was that her principles were about to be tested in ways she never imagined. On the other side of Denver, Officer Kevin Marshall adjusted his badge in the rearview mirror of his patrol car. The morning sun glinted off the polished metal, but it wasn't the shine that caught his attention. It was what the badge represented: power, authority, respect. 12 years on the force had taught Kevin one fundamental truth: there were those who gave orders and those who took them. And Kevin Marshall didn't take orders, not anymore. At 41, he had carved out a reputation in the department. Some called him dedicated, a real cop's cop. Others, particularly in the neighborhoods he patrolled, had different names for him, none of them flattering. Kevin came from a lineage of law enforcement. His father, a decorated captain, had taught him young that authority was something you seized, not something granted. People respect strength, his father would say after his third bourbon, and they'll walk all over weakness. It was a lesson Kevin carried into adulthood, into his academy training, and onto the streets. His record spoke for itself: highest number of arrests in his precinct for years running, multiple commendations for aggressive pursuit of criminal elements, and a file of civilian complaints that his superiors conveniently overlooked. Those complaints: excessive force, racial profiling, intimidation, they were just part of real police work as far as Kevin was concerned. You couldn't maintain order by being soft. The people complaining simply didn't understand what it took to keep the streets safe. When reprimands did come, they were minor administrative leave with pay, sensitivity training that he mocked over beers with colleagues, transfers to new precincts where his reputation didn't immediately follow. The system worked for Kevin Marshall because men like him were the system. Today, though, he was facing something unusual, a court summons to testify about an arrest that had gone sideways. Some college kid claiming brutality, backed by cell phone footage that didn't show the whole story. At least that's how Kevin saw it. Worse, he checked the docket and felt his blood pressure rise. Judge Elena Rodriguez. He'd heard about her, the by-the-book Latina judge who thought she was better than the officers who actually kept the city safe. The thought of answering to her, of being questioned by her, made his jaw clench. Kevin slammed his car door shut and headed toward the courthouse. He wasn't worried. Not really. He'd been in tight spots before, and someone always had his back. That's how it worked for men like him. Today would be no different. Or so he thought. Courtroom 305 of the Denver County Courthouse was already buzzing with activity when Kevin Marshall entered. Attorneys shuffled papers, clerks moved efficiently between desks, and a low murmur of conversations created a backdrop of white noise. Kevin strode in with the confidence of someone who had been in courtrooms dozens of times, always as the authority, never as the subject of scrutiny. He nodded to a couple of officers he recognized, standing guard near the walls. They returned his acknowledgement with slight nods, their expressions neutral, but their eyes conveying a silent message of solidarity. The thin blue line was intact. Elena Rodriguez entered from her chambers, and the bailiff's voice rang out, "All rise for the Honorable Judge Elena Rodriguez." The room fell silent as everyone stood. Elena took her seat, her dark hair pulled back in a simple but elegant bun, her judicial robe perfectly pressed. Her expression was composed, professional, revealing nothing of her thoughts as she scanned the courtroom and spotted Officer Marshall. "Please be seated," she instructed, her voice clear and commanding. As papers rustled and people settled, she continued, "We're here today in the case of Colorado v. James Hernandez. The prosecution may call its first witness." The district attorney, a sharp-dressed man in his 50s, stood. "The state calls Officer Kevin Marshall to the stand." Kevin moved forward with measured steps, taking his time, letting his presence be felt. He was sworn in, his right hand raised, his left on the Bible, the words automatic. "I swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth." As he took his seat in the witness box, his eyes locked with Elena's. She met his gaze evenly, no hint of intimidation in her expression. "Officer Marshall," she said, "please remember that you are under oath. The court expects complete honesty and professionalism." Kevin's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. The subtle reminder, as if he needed to be told how to testify, felt like a deliberate slight. "Of course, Your Honor," he replied, his tone just shy of sarcastic. The questioning began with standard procedure. The district attorney led Kevin through his account of arresting James Hernandez, a 20-year-old student who had allegedly resisted arrest during a traffic stop. Kevin's testimony was smooth, practiced. He'd done this many times before. Mr. Hernandez became aggressive when asked to exit the vehicle. Kevin stated confidently, "I used appropriate force to subdue him and ensure public safety." When the defense attorney's turn came, the atmosphere in the courtroom shifted. The young public defender, Amanda Chen, approached with a tablet in hand. "Officer Marshall, I'd like to show the court some footage captured by a bystander during my client's arrest." The video played on screens throughout the courtroom. It showed a different story than Kevin had just described: a compliant young man being yanked from his car, thrown to the ground with excessive force, a knee pressed into his back as he repeatedly said, "I'm not resisting, sir." Kevin remained outwardly calm, but his knuckles whitened as he gripped the edge of the witness stand. "Officer Marshall," Amanda continued, "would you like to revise your statement about Mr. Hernandez becoming aggressive?" "The video doesn't show the whole interaction," Kevin responded firmly. "Context matters in these situations." So you maintain that your use of force was appropriate despite what we've just seen? Absolutely. Officers have to make split-second decisions to ensure public safety. Elena leaned forward slightly. Officer Marshall, the court needs clarity here. The video evidence appears to contradict your testimony about the defendant's behavior. Kevin shifted in his seat, his posture becoming more rigid. With all due respect, Your Honor, unless you've worn the uniform, you can't fully understand the complexities of these situations. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Elena's expression remained unchanged, but her voice took on a sharper edge. Officer Marshall, this court doesn't require personal experience in law enforcement to evaluate evidence. It requires truthful testimony and respect for the judicial process. Something dark flickered across Kevin's face. The courtroom grew still, the tension palpable as he leaned forward slightly. "You know, Judge," he said, his voice lowered but still audible in the silent room, "it's funny how people like you always think they understand what happens out on the streets." Elena's gaze didn't waver. "Officer Marshall, you will watch your tone in my courtroom. Your experience, while valuable, does not place you above proper decorum or the law itself." The warning was clear, but Kevin had spent too many years being untouchable. He stood suddenly, his movement abrupt enough to make the bailiff step forward. "I don't take orders from people like you," he said, the contempt in his voice unmistakable. The room stiffened. The weight of his words, their unspoken meaning, pressed against every person present. "Officer Marshall," Elena said, her voice steady despite the open disrespect, "sit down immediately, or you will be held in contempt." Kevin's lips curled into a smirk. "I'd love to see you try." What happened next occurred so quickly that many in the courtroom would later give conflicting accounts. Kevin's body tensed. He moved forward, and his fist connected with Elena's face with such force that the sound cracked through the room like a gunshot. Gasps erupted. Papers scattered as people jumped to their feet. The bailiffs froze for a critical second, stunned by the unthinkable act they had just witnessed. Elena's head snapped to the side from the impact. She gripped the bench to steady herself, a trickle of blood appearing at the corner of her mouth. But she didn't fall. Instead, she straightened, wiped the blood with the back of her hand, and fixed Kevin with a gaze so intense it seemed to cut through the chaos erupting around them. In that moment, the courtroom wasn't watching a victim. They were watching justice personified, preparing to strike back. The courtroom had erupted into chaos. Attorneys jumped to their feet, spectators gasped and shouted, and the court reporter stood frozen, her fingers hovering above her stenotype machine as if the unthinkable act she'd just witnessed had short-circuited her professional reflexes. But in the eye of this storm, Judge Elena Rodriguez remained eerily calm. Blood trickled from the corner of her mouth, a bright crimson streak against her olive skin. The impact had left a rapidly darkening mark on her cheek, but her eyes, those eyes that had seen injustice before, remained steady, focused, almost preternaturally composed. Officer Kevin Marshall stood mere feet away, breathing heavily, his fist still clenched at his side. For a split second, there was something like satisfaction in his expression, as if he had just corrected some fundamental error in the universe. But as the seconds ticked by and the reality of what he had done began to sink in, that certainty wavered. Elena slowly reached for her gavel, not to restore order to the chaotic room, but to deliver the first blow of justice. The sound of its striking would silence the room instantly, like a thunderclap preceding a storm. "Officer Kevin Marshall," she said, her voice so clear and steady it seemed impossible coming from someone who had just been struck. "You have assaulted a sitting judge in a court of law." Kevin took a half step forward, his mouth opening as if to speak. But Elena raised her hand, stopping him with nothing more than a gesture. "Bailiffs," she continued, "arrest him." The command hung in the air, heavy and impossible to ignore. Yet the bailiffs hesitated, exchanging uncertain glances. One of them, Chief Bailiff Rodriguez, no relation to the judge, a veteran of 20 years in the courthouse, looked torn between his duty and an unspoken allegiance. "Judge Rodriguez," he began, his voice low, almost cautioning. Elena's gaze shifted to him, unflinching. "That was not a suggestion, Chief Bailiff. It was an order. Officer Marshall has committed a felony assault in this courtroom, witnessed by everyone present." The tension in the room was suffocating. Kevin's expression had shifted from momentary triumph to dawning disbelief. He looked around at the other officers present, his eyes searching for support, for intervention, for the system that had always protected him to activate in his defense. "You can't be serious," he said, his voice caught between a command and a plea. This is the law, Officer Marshall," Elena interrupted. "The same law you swore to uphold." Chief Bailiff Rodriguez moved forward finally, his decision made. He reached for his handcuffs, the metal catching the fluorescent light of the courtroom. "Turn around, please," he said to Kevin, his voice professionally detached, but his eyes communicating something more complex: regret, perhaps, or resignation. "You're making a mistake," Kevin hissed, but the confidence was draining from his voice. "Do you know who I am? Who my father is?" The chief bailiff didn't respond. He simply waited, handcuffs ready. For a moment, it seemed Kevin might resist, might compound his crime with another, but something in the collective gaze of the courtroom stopped him. Perhaps it was the realization that there were too many witnesses, too many cameras, too many people whose silence he couldn't buy or intimidate. The click of the handcuffs closing around Kevin's wrists echoed through the silent courtroom. It was a small sound, insignificant in the grand scheme of things, yet to everyone present, it sounded like the turning of a page in history, the moment when someone who had never faced consequences finally felt the cold grip of accountability. "Read him his rights," Elena instructed, her voice never wavering. As the Miranda warning was recited, Kevin stood statue still, his reality crumbling around him with each familiar word that had always been spoken to others, never to him. Outside the courtroom, the news was already spreading like wildfire. By nightfall, the video had gone viral. Captured on multiple phones in the courtroom's official recording system, the footage of Officer Kevin Marshall striking Judge Elena Rodriguez played on every local news station, national network, and social media platform. The nation watched in collective shock as a uniformed officer assaulted a sitting judge in her own courtroom. The Denver Police Department issued a statement within hours. "We condemn in the strongest possible terms the actions of Officer Marshall. Such behavior is completely counter to our values and training. Officer Marshall has been placed on immediate administrative leave pending a full investigation." The carefully worded statement was textbook crisis management swift, unambiguous condemnation designed to distance the department from a PR catastrophe. But behind the scenes, in precinct houses and private offices, a different conversation was taking place. Elena sat in her chambers the following morning, reviewing a stack of documents related to Kevin's case, when a knock came at her door. District Attorney Thomas Wilkins entered without waiting for her response, his expression grave. "This is a mistake, Elena," he said without preamble, closing the door behind him. Elena looked up, her bruised face a stark reminder of the previous day's events. "Good morning to you too, Thomas." "I wasn't aware that upholding the law had become a mistake," Wilkins sighed, taking a seat across from her. "You know, that's not what I mean. Marshall's already been booked. You've made your point. But pushing for maximum charges, requesting no bail, you're poking a hornet's nest." "A hornet's nest," she repeated, setting down her pen. "Is that what we're calling the justice system now?" "Don't be naive," Wilkins said, leaning forward. "Marshall's father was Captain James Marshall. His uncle is on the city council. His connections run deep, and the police union is already mobilizing. They're spinning this as an isolated incident by an officer under extreme stress. I was there, Thomas. Everyone in that courtroom was there. There's video evidence. Are you suggesting we ignore all that because he has powerful friends? Wilkins ran a hand over his face. I'm suggesting you be strategic. Let another judge handle this. Recuse yourself. We can still pursue charges, but with someone else on the bench, someone without your history. Elena's expression hardened. My history? Your father's case. Your outspoken positions on police accountability. They're already painting you as biased, as having an agenda. The defense will use that. I do have an agenda, Elena said quietly. Justice. The same agenda every judge and prosecutor is supposed to have. Before Wilkins could respond, Elena's phone buzzed with a text message. She glanced at it briefly, then back at the DA. The Police Officers Association has called a press conference for noon, she said. Let me guess they'll express concern about Marshall while questioning my impartiality. Wilkins didn't confirm or deny, but his expression told her everything. Elena, listen to me. The system is bigger than any one case. If you make this personal. It became personal when Officer Marshall decided to assault me in my courtroom. Elena interrupted, her voice sharp. But this isn't about me. This is about what happens every day to people who don't have a gavel or a law degree to protect them. People who get assaulted by those sworn to protect them and are told to just accept it as the cost of doing business. There was a long silence between them. Finally, Wilkins stood, straightening his tie. I'll do my job, Elena. The DA's office will prosecute. But I'm asking you as a colleague and a friend, be careful. They're coming for you, and they won't play fair. After he left, Elena sat alone in her chambers, the weight of his warning settling on her shoulders. Her phone buzzed again, another message. This one from an unknown number. Back off now or regret it. She deleted it without a second thought. Threats didn't scare her. What scared her was the thought of walking away, of allowing the system to protect its own once again, while justice became nothing more than a word engraved on courthouse walls outside her window. News vans had already begun to gather. The solitude of Elena's home had always been her sanctuary, a place where she could shed the weight of the gavel and simply exist as herself. Tonight, however, the walls seemed to press in on her, the silence more oppressive than comforting. She stood by the kitchen window, nursing a cup of tea that had long gone cold, watching the occasional car drive past her modest suburban home. One vehicle, a dark sedan with tinted windows, had passed by 3 times in the last hour. A coincidence, perhaps. Or perhaps not. The doorbell rang, startling her from her thoughts. Elena approached cautiously, checking the peephole before opening the door. Detective Marcus James stood on her porch, not in his usual suit, but in jeans and a plain button-down shirt. At 45, Marcus was a veteran of the Denver Police Department, known for his integrity and no-nonsense approach. He was also one of the few people in law enforcement Elena genuinely respected. Detective James, she said, opening the door but not stepping aside. This is unexpected. May I come in, Judge Rodriguez? He asked, his voice low. What I have to say shouldn't be discussed on your front porch. Elena hesitated, then nodded, letting him in. They moved to her living room, neither taking a seat. You're not here in an official capacity, she observed. No, he confirmed. Officially, I'm at home watching the Broncos game. So why are you really here? Marcus sighed, the weight of 22 years in law enforcement visible in the slump of his shoulders. To warn you. They're not going to let this go, Judge Rodriguez. Marshall isn't just some cop who crossed a line. He's connected. Protected. I'm aware of his connections, Elena said. His father, his uncle on the city council. It's more than that, Marcus said. There's a group within the department officers who've been operating by their own rules for years. Marshall is one of them. They protect each other, cover for each other. And now they're mobilizing against you. Elena crossed her arms. Are you suggesting I should be afraid? I'm suggesting you should be prepared. They're going to dig into your past, your cases, every decision you've ever made from the bench. They'll look for anything they can use to discredit you, to paint you as biased or unstable. Let them try, Elena said, but even as the words left her mouth, she felt the enormity of the fight ahead. Marcus stepped closer, lowering his voice. There's more. They're trying to influence the potential jury pool. Quiet conversations, social media campaigns through proxies, establishing a narrative that Marshall is the real victim, a dedicated officer being persecuted for one mistake. Elena's jaw tightened. So they're tampering with justice before the trial even begins. That's one way to put it, Marcus agreed. I can't stop them, Judge Rodriguez. I'm just one detective, and if they knew I was here. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Why are you telling me this? Elena asked. Why take the risk? Marcus looked away for a moment, then met her gaze directly. Because I'm tired, he said simply. Tired of watching good cops get dragged down by the bad ones. Tired of a system that protects the wrong people. And maybe because 20 years ago, I was a rookie who didn't speak up when I should have. I've been making up for it ever since. As he turned to leave, he paused at the door. Watch your back, Judge. This isn't just about Marshall anymore. This is about power, who has it, and who gets to keep it. After he left, Elena locked the door and returned to the window. The dark sedan was gone, but the unease remained. Her phone chimed with an email notification, an anonymous message with no subject line. She opened it to find a single image, her home, photographed earlier that day, with a red X drawn across it. They were trying to intimidate her. What they didn't understand was that Elena Rodriguez had spent her entire life being told to back down, to know her place, to accept things as they were. She had never once listened. Her doorbell rang again. This time, when she checked, no one was there. Just a thick manila envelope on her welcome mat. The contents of the manila envelope lay spread across Elena's dining room table, page after page of police reports, internal memos, and personnel files, most heavily redacted, but still damning in what they revealed. Kevin Marshall's history of excessive force complaints, instances where evidence had mysteriously disappeared, testimonies that had been changed or withdrawn. But it was the final document, unredacted and placed deliberately at the bottom of the stack, that had caused Elena's hands to tremble, a police report from 20 years ago, detailing the arrest of one Michael Rodriguez for alleged theft of auto parts. And there it was, in black and white, Officer K. Marshall listed as the arresting officer's partner. A rookie cop on his first week of patrol, accompanying the more senior officer who had brought her father in on false charges. The same Kevin Marshall who had struck her in her courtroom. The same man whose career had been built on the foundation of injustice that had altered her family's trajectory forever. Elena sat back, her mind racing. It couldn't be coincidence. Someone wanted her to know this, wanted her to understand that this case was more personal than she'd realized. But who? An ally within the department? Or was it a trap designed to provoke her into making emotional decisions that could later be used against her? Her phone rang, breaking the silence. Unknown number. She answered cautiously. Judge Rodriguez. The voice was distorted, deliberately disguised. By now you've seen the files. Who is this? Elena demanded. A friend. The voice replied. Someone who believes in justice. But you need to understand what you're up against. They're coming for you, not just your career, but everything. I'm not afraid, Elena said firmly. You should be, the voice insisted. Backing Marshall into a corner was like caging a rabid animal. He's got friends in places you can't even imagine: judges, politicians, business leaders who owe him favors. Is that supposed to make me reconsider? Elena asked. Because all it's doing is confirming that I'm on the right path. There was a pause, then a sigh. The trial is scheduled for Judge William Hayes' courtroom. Do you know him? Elena felt a chill. William Hayes, a judge known for his pro-law enforcement stance, his country club membership alongside several high-ranking police officials, his tendency to dismiss excessive force cases before they reached a jury. Yes, she said quietly. I know him. Then you know what's coming, the voice said. Marshall will walk unless the line went dead. Elena tried calling back, but it went straight to a disconnected message. Outside, a car alarm went off her car. Elena moved to the window and saw 3 masked figures surrounding her vehicle, one smashing the driver's side window, while another spray-painted something on the hood. By the time she called 911 and the police arrived taking their time, she noted bitterly the vandals were gone. But their message remained, bright red against the dark paint of her car. Back off, or next time it's you. The responding officers took minimal notes, exchanged glances when they thought she wasn't looking, and promised to look into it, a phrase Elena had heard too many times in her career to believe. As they left, one young officer lingered behind. Judge Rodriguez, he said quietly, looking over his shoulder to ensure his partner couldn't hear. Be careful. Not everyone on the force is against you, but those who are, he swallowed hard. Just watch yourself, okay? Double-quotes.it was the second warning she'd received that night. Elena nodded, thanking him with her eyes. As his patrol car pulled away, she stood in her driveway, looking at her vandalized car and making a decision. If they thought threats would silence her, they were sorely mistaken. They had just made it personal. And Elena Rodriguez never backed down from a fight, especially one that mattered. The Denver Justice Center stood like a fortress in the morning light, its modern glass facade reflecting the blue Colorado sky. For decades, it had been a symbol of the rule of law, impartial, steadfast, above the fray of politics and personal vendettas. But today, as crowds gathered on its steps, that symbolism felt hollow. Television crews jostled for position, their satellite vans forming a perimeter around the building. Protesters had split into 2 distinct groups. On one side, activists with signs reading "No one above the law" and "Justice for all." On the other, supporters of Officer Marshall, many in blue shirts with slogans like "Back the Blue" and "Support our officers." Inside, past security checkpoints and through marble corridors, Elena Rodriguez sat on a bench outside courtroom for B. Though not presiding over the case, she would be the prosecution's key witness, and her presence today was required for pre-trial motions. She wore a tailored Navy suit instead of her judicial robe, a civilian in this proceeding, despite her position. The door to the courtroom opened, and out walked Catherine Wells, the lead prosecutor assigned to the case. Catherine was known for her methodical approach and unflappable demeanor qualities that had made her the district attorney's choice for this high-profile case. Judge Rodriguez, she said, sitting beside Elena. How are you holding up? I've been better, Elena admitted, touching the fading bruise on her cheek. But I'm ready. How's it looking in there? Catherine's expression tightened slightly. Marshall's attorney is moving to suppress the courtroom video. Claims it would prejudice the jury. That's absurd, Elena said. The video is the primary evidence. Judge Hayes is taking it under advisement, Catherine replied, her tone carefully neutral, but her eyes conveying her concern. The implication was clear. William Hayes, a judge known for his conservative views and close relationships with law enforcement, had been assigned to the case through what the court administrator had called standard random selection. Few believed that explanation. "There's more," Catherine continued, lowering her voice. "They're pushing to allow character witnesses to testify about Marshall's exemplary record and community service, while simultaneously filing motions to exclude evidence of his prior complaints." Elena wasn't surprised. This was exactly the kind of maneuvering she had expected, the system closing ranks, changing the rules to protect one of its own. "And Marshall's attorney?" Elena asked. "Richard Bennett." Catherine replied. Elena felt a chill. Bennett was one of Denver's most prominent defense attorneys, known for representing police officers in misconduct cases and for his near-perfect record of getting charges reduced or dismissed entirely. His services commanded fees that a police officer's salary couldn't possibly cover. "Someone's backing him," Elena observed. "Someone with deep pockets and deeper interests," Catherine nodded. "The Police Officers Association has publicly distanced themselves from Marshall, but sources say they are quietly funding his defense. And there are rumors about private donations from business leaders who've benefited from having friends in the department." Before Elena could respond, the courtroom doors opened again. Officer Kevin Marshall emerged, flanked by his attorney and two supporters. Gone was the uniform that had once been his armor. Today he wore a conservative gray suit, a muted tie, and an expression of somber dignity, the picture of a respectable public servant wrongfully accused. His eyes met Elena's briefly. There was no remorse there, no acknowledgement of what he had done. Instead, there was something colder, something that might have been hatred or perhaps fear, the look of a man who had always considered himself untouchable suddenly facing the possibility that he wasn't. Bennett placed a protective hand on Marshall's shoulder, guiding him away from Elena. As they walked down the corridor, Bennett leaned in to whisper something in Marshall's ear. Both men glanced back at Elena before disappearing around a corner. "They're playing to the public," Catherine observed. Marshall, the dedicated officer, momentarily overcome by stress, now facing a witch hunt, "and I'm the witch," Elena said with a grim smile. "For what it's worth," Catherine replied, standing as her assistant signaled to her from down the hall. "Most of the legal community is behind you. What happened in that courtroom wasn't just an assault on you, it was an assault on the entire judicial system." As Catherine walked away, Elena remained on the bench, watching the parade of legal personnel entering and exiting the courtroom. She had spent her career in these halls, believing in the system despite its flaws. Now she was about to find out if that belief had been misplaced all along. The trial of Officer Kevin Marshall began on a Monday morning, the courtroom packed beyond capacity. Judge William Hayes presided with a stern demeanor, his instructions to the gallery about maintaining decorum delivered with the gravity of a man who understood the historical significance of the proceedings. The prosecution's opening statement had been concise and powerful, a clear account of the events, a reminder of the sacred trust placed in both officers and the courts, and a promise to prove beyond reasonable doubt that Marshall had committed felony assault against a judge in her own courtroom. Now Richard Bennett rose for the defense, his tall frame and silver hair giving him a distinguished appearance as he approached the jury box. He moved with the confidence of a man who had stood in this same spot dozens of times and rarely left disappointed. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he began, his voice warm and conversational, "what you will hear over the coming days is a story about human beings. Not symbols, not abstractions, not representations of institutions, but real people with real emotions. Facing real pressures, he paced slowly, making eye contact with each juror in turn. Officer Kevin Marshall has served this community for 12 years. 12 years of answering calls in the middle of the night, of entering dangerous situations while others flee, of making split-second decisions that could mean life or death, Bennett gestured to Marshall, who sat at the defense table with perfect posture, his expression respectful and attentive. The prosecution wants you to see only one moment, 10 seconds from a career spanning over a decade. They want you to judge a man's entire character, his entire worth, based on a single action taken under extraordinary circumstances. He paused, letting the words sink in before continuing. What the prosecution won't tell you is the context. They won't tell you about the threats Officer Marshall had received in the weeks before this incident, threats against him and his family from gang members he had helped put away. They won't tell you about the 60-hour weeks he had been working due to department understaffing, or about the 3 life-threatening situations he had faced in the month prior. None of this was true, or at least, there was no evidence of it in Marshall's personnel file or police reports, but Bennett delivered the claims with such conviction that they took on the weight of established fact. They certainly won't tell you about Judge Rodriguez's history of antagonism toward law enforcement. Bennett continued, his voice dropping slightly as if sharing a confidence. About her pattern of ruling against officers in excessive force cases, about her public statements questioning police tactics, about her personal connections to anti-police advocacy groups. At the prosecution table, Catherine Wells stood. Objection, Your Honor. Counsel is making unsubstantiated claims about a witness. Judge Hayes nodded. Sustained. Mr. Bennett, please confine your opening statement to what you expect the evidence to show. Of course, Your Honor, Bennett replied smoothly, not at all disrupted by the interruption. The evidence will show that on the day in question, Officer Marshall was under extraordinary stress. He was being questioned about a case where his professional judgment was being second-guessed by people who have never worn the badge, never faced the dangers he faces daily. He walked back to the defense table, resting his hand briefly on Marshall's shoulder. The evidence will show that Judge Rodriguez's tone and manner during questioning were confrontational and dismissive. And while nothing justifies physical contact, the evidence will show that what occurred was not the calculated assault the prosecution describes, but a momentary, stress-induced reaction by a dedicated public servant pushed beyond human endurance. Bennett returned to the jury box, his voice now intimate, almost conspiratorial. Ladies and gentlemen, the law recognizes that intent matters. Context matters. Character matters. You will hear testimony from Officer Marshall's colleagues, from community members whose lives he has touched, from experts in stress-related behavior. And when you have heard all the evidence, I am confident you will find that what happened in that courtroom was tragic for all involved, but it was not the crime the prosecution has described. He returned to his seat beside Marshall, who nodded slightly in appreciation. From her place in the gallery, Elena watched the performance with growing concern. Bennett was doing exactly what she had feared, humanizing Marshall, contextualizing his actions, and subtly shifting blame. And based on the expressions of several jurors, his approach was finding a receptive audience. The battle for justice had only just begun, and already the ground beneath it was shifting. Day 3 of the trial brought Elena Rodriguez to the witness stand. The courtroom fell silent as she was sworn in, the weight of her testimony hanging in the air. As both a judge and the victim, her account would carry unique significance. Catherine Wells approached, her questions methodical and precise, designed to establish a clear, factual record of what had occurred that day in courtroom 305. Judge Rodriguez, please describe for the jury what happened during Officer Marshall's testimony. Elena spoke with composed clarity, recounting Marshall's increasingly disrespectful behavior, his open defiance of courtroom decorum, and finally, the moment when he had struck her. He said, "I don't take orders from people like you," Elena testified. When I warned him about contempt of court, he stood up and said, "I'd love to see you try." Then he stepped forward and struck me with his closed fist, What did you understand him to mean by people like you? Catherine asked. Before Elena could answer, Bennett was on his feet. Objection, Your Honor. Calls for speculation. Sustained. Judge Hayes ruled quickly. The witness cannot testify to what was in the defendant's mind. Catherine nodded, accepting the ruling. Judge Rodriguez, had you had any previous interactions with Officer Marshall before that day? No, Elena replied. I had never met him personally, so his apparent hostility toward you couldn't have been based on prior personal interactions. Objection. Bennett called again. Assumes facts, not in evidence. There's no established hostility. Judge Hayes considered this. Overruled. The witness may answer. No, Elena said firmly. There was no history between us that could explain his behavior. Catherine moved methodically through the events, having Elena describe the immediate aftermath, the initial hesitation of the bailiffs, and the subsequent arrest. Throughout, Elena remained poised, her testimony clear and unembellished, exactly what juries found most credible. When it was Bennett's turn for cross-examination, the atmosphere in the courtroom shifted. The defense attorney approached with a sympathetic smile that didn't reach his eyes. Judge Rodriguez, first let me say how sorry I am that you experienced this incident. No one should be subjected to physical aggression, especially in a courtroom. Elena nodded slightly, recognizing the tactical empathy for what it was a prelude to attack. Now, you testified that you had never met Officer Marshall before that day. But you were familiar with his record, weren't you? Catherine stood. Objection. Relevance, Your Honor, Bennett countered. I'm establishing the witness's potential bias or preconceptions about my client. I'll allow it, Judge Hayes ruled. The witness will answer. Elena kept her expression neutral. As a judge, I don't review officers' personnel records before they testify. I had no special knowledge of Officer Marshall's history. Bennett raised an eyebrow slightly. Really? You weren't aware of the multiple excessive force complaints against him? The internal affairs investigations? None of that was brought to your attention before he appeared in your courtroom? No, Elena replied firmly. Bennett picked up a document from the defense table. Your Honor, I'd like to enter Defense Exhibit 14 into evidence. These are Judge Rodriguez's calendar entries from the month before the incident. After the document was admitted, Bennett continued, Judge Rodriguez, this entry from 3 weeks before the incident shows a lunch meeting with Maria Sandoval, the director of the Denver Police Accountability Project. Would you care to explain that meeting? Elena remained calm despite the clear implication. Miss Sandoval is an old law school classmate. We occasionally meet for lunch. We don't discuss specific cases or officers. Bennett's smile tightened. And you expect the jury to believe that in these lunches, you never discussed the very issues her organization was created to address? Police misconduct? Officer accountability? Perhaps even specific officers with concerning records? Objection, Catherine called. Counsel is badgering the witness. Sustained. Judge Hayes ruled, though with noticeable reluctance. Move on, Mr. Bennett. Bennett nodded, but his point had been made, the seed of doubt planted. He shifted tactics, now focusing on Elena's demeanor during Marshall's testimony. Judge Rodriguez, would you say you were completely impartial in your treatment of Officer Marshall that day? Were there any comments, any tones of voice that might have been perceived as hostile or antagonistic? I treated Officer Marshall exactly as I would any witness who displayed similar behavior. Elena responded evenly. That's not what I asked, Bennett pressed. I asked if anything in your manner could have been perceived as hostile. Elena paused, choosing her words carefully. Perception is subjective, Mr. Bennett. I maintained professional judicial demeanor throughout the proceedings. Bennett's expression suggested he found this answer wanting. For the next 40 minutes, he continued his methodical attempt to undermine Elena's credibility, suggesting inconsistencies in her testimony, implying bias in her judicial history, and repeatedly returning to her alleged connections with police accountability groups. By the time she was excused from the stand, Elena could see the damage Bennett had done, not through any smoking gun or dramatic revelation, but through the cumulative effect of insinuation and implication, portraying her not as an impartial judge who had been assaulted, but as an activist with an agenda who had somehow provoked the incident. As she returned to her seat, she caught Catherine's eye. The prosecutor gave her a reassuring nod, but Elena could see the concern behind it. The prosecution's strongest witness had been effectively painted as biased, and the video evidence, their most compelling proof, was still under dispute, with Judge Hayes yet to rule on its admissibility. Justice, it seemed, was proving even more elusive than Elena had feared. After 2 weeks of testimony, closing arguments, and breathless media coverage, the case was finally in the jury's hands. The 12 citizens of Denver who would decide Kevin Marshall's fate filed out of the courtroom, their expressions unreadable as they began their deliberations. The waiting was excruciating. Hours stretched into a day, then 2. Outside the courthouse, the protests had grown larger and more vocal, the division between Marshall's supporters and detractors increasingly stark. Police presence had been doubled, with officers forming a buffer between the opposing groups. Inside, Elena sat in her office, having recused herself from her own cases until the verdict came in. The strain of the past weeks showed in the shadows beneath her eyes, in the tension that had become a permanent fixture in her shoulders. Yet her resolve remained undiminished. A knock at her door pulled her from her thoughts. It was Catherine Wells, looking as exhausted as Elena felt. "The jury's coming back," Catherine said simply. "They've reached a verdict." Elena nodded, rising to gather her things. They walked in silence through the courthouse corridors, the weight of the moment making words unnecessary. As they entered the courtroom, Elena could feel the collective gaze of everyone present, some supportive, others hostile, all intensely curious. Judge Hayes called the court to order, his gavel echoing in the suddenly silent room. Kevin Marshall sat at the defense table, his attorney beside him, both men projecting confidence despite the gravity of the moment. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" Judge Hayes asked the forewoman, a middle-aged woman who had been attentive throughout the trial. "We have, Your Honor," she replied, her voice steady as she handed a folded paper to the bailiff, who delivered it to the judge. Judge Hayes read it silently, his expression giving nothing away. He returned the paper to the bailiff, who handed it back to the forewoman. "The defendant will please rise," Judge Hayes instructed. Kevin Marshall stood, his attorney rising beside him. For the first time in the proceedings, a crack appeared in Marshall's composed facade, a slight twitch at the corner of his mouth, a barely perceptible tremor in his hands. In the case of the state of Colorado versus Kevin Marshall, on the charge of felony assault against a judicial officer, how does the jury find? Judge Hayes asked. The forewoman unfolded the paper, though she clearly knew the verdict by heart. She looked directly at Marshall as she spoke. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Kevin Marshall, guilty." The courtroom erupted. Gasps, cries of outrage and vindication, reporters rushing for the doors to break the news. Judge Hayes banged his gavel repeatedly, calling for order. Marshall stood frozen, the color draining from his face as the reality of the verdict hit him. Beside him, Bennett placed a steadying hand on his arm, already whispering about appeals and options. When order was finally restored, Judge Hayes addressed Marshall directly. "Mr. Marshall, you have been found guilty by a jury of your peers. Sentencing will take place 1 week from today. Until then, your bail is revoked. You will be remanded to custody." As the bailiffs moved to take Marshall away, He turned to look directly at Elena. Their eyes met across the courtroom, and in that moment, something passed between them, not forgiveness, not understanding, but perhaps a mutual recognition. The system that had protected him for so long had finally turned against him. The judge he had thought he could intimidate had stood firm. 1 week later, Elena returned to the courtroom for the sentencing. Judge Hayes, to the surprise of many, showed no leniency. "Mr. Marshall," he began, his voice grave, "your actions struck at the very foundation of our judicial system. When an officer of the law assaults an officer of the court, it tears at the fabric that holds our society together. It undermines public trust in both institutions." He paused, looking down at Marshall from the bench. "I sentence you to 15 years in state prison, with no possibility of parole for the first 10 years. Your peace officer certification will be permanently revoked, and you will be barred from any future employment in law enforcement." As Marshall was led away in handcuffs, Elena sat quietly in the gallery. There was no triumph in her expression, no satisfaction, only a solemn acknowledgment that justice, however imperfect, had been served. Outside, as reporters clamored for a statement, Elena paused on the courthouse steps. The bruise on her face had faded, but the impact of what had happened would remain, not just for her, but for everyone who had witnessed a system finally holding one of its own accountable. "This case was never about me," she told the assembled press. "It was about upholding the principle that no one, no matter their position, their power, or their connections, is above the law. That principle was affirmed today, not just for judges or officers, but for every citizen who depends on our justice system to be fair and impartial." As she walked away from the microphones, Elena knew that this victory, significant as it was, represented only one battle in a much longer war. The system that had protected Kevin Marshall for years remained largely intact, with countless others like him still operating within it. But something had changed. A precedent had been set. A message had been sent. And perhaps, just perhaps, that would make a difference for the next judge, the next victim, the next person brave enough to stand up and say, "Enough." The harsh Chicago winter had turned the city into a landscape of steel and ice. Officer Michael Ramirez pulled his patrol car to the curb, deciding to walk the last few blocks of his beat before ending his shift. Despite the bitter cold, he preferred to finish on foot. It kept him connected to the neighborhood in a way that sitting behind a windshield couldn't. His breath formed clouds in the frigid air as he moved through the deserted streets. It was just past midnight, and the temperature had dropped below 20 degrees. Most people were inside, huddled against the cold, leaving the city eerily quiet. Michael was thinking about his apartment, about the hot shower and warm bed waiting for him, when he heard it. A faint rustling sound coming from the alley to his right. Probably just a stray cat, he thought, but his training and instincts prompted him to investigate. He turned into the alley, his hand instinctively moving to rest on his holstered weapon. The weak yellow glow from distant street lights barely penetrated the darkness, casting long shadows across the snow-dusted ground. The rustling grew louder as he advanced, and then he heard something that made him freeze, the unmistakable sound of a child crying. "Hello?" he called out, his voice echoing off the brick walls. "Police officer. Is someone there?" The rustling stopped. The crying silenced. Michael unclipped his flashlight and swept its beam through the darkness, illuminating a dumpster against the wall. Beside it, like startled deer caught in headlights, were two small figures. Twin girls, no more than 6 years old, huddled together beside the dumpster. One was bent over, digging through a trash bag spread on the ground. The other stood slightly behind, clutching a torn cloth doll to her chest. Both wore thin jackets wholly inadequate for the freezing temperature, their small hands bare and reddened from the cold. As the light hit them, the first girl straightened and stepped protectively in front of her sister, her eyes wide with fear, but her stance defiant. Michael felt his heart constrict. In his 7 years on the force, he had seen many things that had hardened him, but the sight of these two small children alone, cold, scavenging for food from garbage bags, struck him with a visceral force that took his breath away. He lowered his flashlight slightly to avoid blinding them and crouched down, making himself smaller, less threatening. "Hey there," he said softly. "My name's Officer Ramirez." "Michael, are you two okay?" The girl in front lifted her chin slightly. "We're fine," she said, her voice small but surprisingly steady. "We don't need help." But even as she spoke, her sister coughed a harsh, rattling sound that betrayed how far from fine they truly were. "You two must be freezing out here," Michael said, keeping his tone gentle. "Where are your parents?" The first girl's eyes darted to the side. "There. Coming back soon." It was a lie, and they both knew it. Michael had worked enough cases involving homeless or abandoned children to recognize the signs, the wariness in their eyes, the premature self-sufficiency, the protective instinct of the slightly older child. "What's your name?" he asked, a hesitation then. "Sofia." "And this is Isabel." "Sofia and Isabel," Michael repeated. "That's pretty. Listen, it's too cold to stay out here. How about I take you somewhere warm? Get you something to eat that's not from the trash?" Sofia's eyes narrowed with suspicion. "Are you going to take us to the children's center?" The question carried layers of meaning. Michael understood immediately that they had been there before, and that whatever had happened had left them preferring the streets to returning. "Not right now," he said carefully. "First, I think we should get you checked out at the hospital. Make sure you're okay. Then we can figure out the rest." "What do you say?" Isabel, still partially hidden behind her sister, whispered something. Sofia listened, then looked back at Michael. "She wants to know if you promise not to separate us." The request hit Michael like a physical blow. These were children who had already learned that promises were easily broken, that adults couldn't be trusted, that the world was a place where even asking to stay with your twin could be too much to hope for. "I promise," he said. And he meant it with a conviction that surprised even him. "You'll stay together." Sofia studied his face for a long moment, searching for any sign of deception. Then slowly she nodded. "Okay," she said. "But just for tonight. Because it's cold." As Michael radioed for an ambulance and guided the girls to his patrol car, he felt something shift inside him, a certainty that this night would change the trajectory of all their lives. What he didn't know yet was just how profound the change would be. The pediatric ward of Chicago Memorial Hospital was quiet at a.m., the only sound the soft beeping of monitors and the occasional squeak of nurses' shoes on the polished floor. Michael sat in an uncomfortable plastic chair outside the examination room where doctors were checking Sofia and Isabel. He had stayed with them through the initial intake, had held Isabel's small hand while a nurse drew blood, had reassured Sofia that no, they wouldn't be separated, not even for different exams. Now, temporarily alone, he pulled out his phone and stared at the screen, at the name he needed to call, but was suddenly hesitant too. Taking a deep breath, he pressed dial. "Michael," Rebecca's voice was thick with sleep. "It's the middle of the night. Are you okay?" "I'm fine," he said quickly. "I'm at the hospital, but I'm not hurt." He heard rustling as she sat up, instantly alert. "The hospital? What happened?" Michael explained about finding Sofia and Isabel, about their condition, malnourished, dehydrated, with early signs of frostbite on their fingers and toes, and about his promise to keep them together. "The social worker is coming in the morning," he finished. "But Becca, I can't stop thinking about them. They were searching through garbage for food. In this weather." There was a pause on the other end of the line. When Rebecca spoke again, her voice was gentle but cautious. "Michael, I know this must have been awful to see, but the system exists for exactly this reason. The girls will be placed in emergency foster care, hopefully together. They'll be okay." "Will they?" Michael asked, the words coming out more sharply than he intended. "You know as well as I do what happens. Foster placements are overloaded. Siblings get separated all the time. And Sofia already mentioned the Children's Center like it was something to be afraid of. What if they've already been through the system and it failed them?" Rebecca sighed. He could picture her sitting up in their bed, running a hand through her dark hair, the way she did when she was trying to be patient. "What exactly are you saying, Michael?" He hadn't fully formed the thought himself until that moment, but as soon as the words left his mouth, he knew they were true. "I want to foster them. Maybe even adopt them." The silence that followed seemed to stretch forever. "You can't be serious," Rebecca finally said. "We're getting married in 8 months. We've talked about having kids. Yes, but in the future. After we're settled. After we've had time as a couple. And now you want to bring home twin girls? Tonight?" "Not tonight," Michael clarified. "They'll be in the hospital for at least a few days. But afterward, yes." "This is crazy," Rebecca said, her voice rising slightly. "You met these children 3 hours ago. You don't know anything about them, about their backgrounds, about what they've been through." "I know they need help," Michael said simply. "And I know I can provide it." Rebecca corrected. "You mean we can provide it?" "Because this would affect me too, Michael. This would completely change our plans: the wedding, the house we're saving for, our careers. Have you thought about any of that?" The truth was, he hadn't, not in any detail. All he knew was the certainty he had felt in that alley, the connection that had formed instantly when Sofia had looked at him with those 2 old eyes in her young face. "I'm sorry," he said, and he meant it. "You're right. This would change everything. And I should have talked to you first, before I even started thinking about it." "But Becca, if you had seen them—" "I need time," Rebecca interrupted. "This is too much to process at AM. We'll talk tomorrow, okay?" After they hung up, Michael sat staring at his phone, the weight of what he was considering settling fully on his shoulders. Rebecca was right. This was impulsive, potentially reckless. His apartment was barely big enough for 1 person, let alone 3. His hours as a patrol officer were irregular at best. He knew nothing about raising children, especially children who had clearly experienced trauma. But then the door to the examination room opened, and a doctor emerged, beckoning him inside. And there were Sofia and Isabel, looking even smaller in hospital gowns. Sofia sitting protectively on the edge of Isabel's bed. "Officer," the doctor said quietly, "can I speak with you outside for a moment?" In the hallway, the doctor's expression was grave. "Those girls are severely malnourished. The younger one has early stages of pneumonia, and there are signs of older injuries, healed fractures, scarring. These aren't children who just recently became homeless. They've been neglected for a long time." Michael nodded, his resolve hardening. "I know a social worker is coming, but is there any way I could begin the process to become their foster parent? I have a background in youth services from before I joined the force." The doctor looked surprised, then thoughtful. "That would be up to DCFs, but I can make some calls." "Are you sure about this, Officer Ramirez? Taking on 2 traumatized children isn't something to be done on impulse." "I've never been more sure of anything," Michael replied, and as he said it, he realized it was true, even if it meant making the hardest choice of his life. The next 2 weeks unfolded in a blur of hospital visits, meetings with social workers, paperwork, and increasingly tense conversations with Rebecca. Michael took every available shift change to ensure he could spend time with Sofia and Isabel, bringing them books, small toys, and most importantly, his consistent presence. Dr. Patel, the pediatrician overseeing their care, had warned him that children who had experienced abandonment often tested new attachments, pushing away the very people they most wanted to stay. Michael saw this firsthand as Sofia alternated between cautious acceptance and deliberate distance. "You don't have to keep coming," she told him on the fifth day, her small face serious as she colored in a book he had brought. "We're used to being on our own. I know I don't have to," Michael replied, carefully keeping his tone casual. "I want to." Sofia glanced up, studying him with that penetrating gaze that seemed far too perceptive for a 6-year-old. "People always leave eventually." The simple statement, delivered with such matter-of-fact certainty, broke Michael's heart. "Not always, Sofia. I promise," she returned to her coloring. "You shouldn't make promises you can't keep." Isabel, by contrast, was gradually warming to him. She spoke little. Sofia usually answered for both of them, but she had begun to smile when he arrived, and the previous day had even shown him a drawing she had made. 3 stick figures, 1 tall, 2 small, all holding hands. "Is that us?" Michael had asked, and Isabel had nodded shyly before returning to Sofia's side. It was progress, small but significant, and it fueled Michael's determination as he navigated the complex requirements of becoming a foster parent on an expedited timeline. His background as a police officer helped, as did his previous experience working with at-risk youth at a community center before joining the force. But there were still home inspections to pass, parenting classes to attend, and financial stability to prove, and then there was Rebecca. They had been together for 3 years, engaged for 1. She was a corporate attorney with a promising career, ambitious and focused. They had planned a life together that included children eventually. Her shock at Michael's sudden desire to foster the twins had turned to frustration, then anger, and finally an ultimatum. "I can't do this, Michael," she had said the night before, removing her engagement ring and placing it on the kitchen counter between them. "It's not that I don't support what you're doing. It's beautiful, it really is. But it's not what I signed up for." "Not now. Things change, Becca," he had replied, his voice strained. "Sometimes life doesn't follow the schedule we set." "I know that. But this isn't a minor detour. This is completely rewriting our future. These girls will need stability, consistency. They'll need parents who are fully committed, not one parent who's all in and one who's resentful and overwhelmed." She had been right, of course. Rebecca usually was. But knowing that didn't make the pain of watching her walk out the door any less acute. Now, sitting beside Isabel's hospital bed while both girls napped, Michael turned his phone over in his hands. 3 missed calls from Rebecca. A text asking him to please call her, to talk things through one more time. Maybe there was still a chance to salvage their relationship, to find a compromise. He glanced at the sleeping girls, at Sofia's hand, still protectively resting on her sister's arm even in sleep, and knew there was no compromise to be had. He had made a promise not just with his words, but with his heart, and he intended to keep it, whatever the cost. The social worker, Mrs. Chen, had told him that morning that he had been provisionally approved as a foster parent. The girls could be released into his care as early as next week, provided his apartment passed the final inspection. It would pass. Michael had spent every spare moment transforming his bachelor pad into a home for 3, setting up the small second bedroom with twin beds, a colorful rug, and a nightlight. He had arranged for family leave from the department, adjusted his savings to account for the additional expenses, and begun researching schools in his neighborhood. As Isabel stirred slightly in her sleep, Michael put his phone away without returning Rebecca's calls. Some choices, once made, couldn't be unmade, nor would he want them to be. The day Sofia and Isabel came home with Michael was unseasonably warm for March, as if Chicago had decided to offer them a gentle welcome after the harshness of winter. Michael had picked them up from the hospital in his personal car, their few belongings packed in a single shared duffel bag, a stark reminder of how little they had. "This is it," he said, opening the door to his apartment with a slightly nervous smile. "It's not huge, but it's ours." Sofia entered first, her hand firmly holding Isabel's, her eyes sweeping the space with practiced wariness, noting exits, assessing safety, the instinctive scan of a child who had learned to be vigilant. Isabel followed, her gaze immediately drawn to the small bedroom visible through an open door. "Is that for us?" she asked, speaking directly to Michael for the first time without Sofia answering for her. "It is," Michael confirmed, setting down their bag. "Do you want to see it?" Isabel looked to Sofia, who gave a slight nod. Together, they walked to the doorway and peered inside. Michael had done his best with his limited resources and even more limited interior design skills. 2 twin beds with colorful comforters, a bookshelf filled with children's books he had picked up from the library book sale, a small desk with art supplies, and a stuffed animal on each pillow, a bear for Sofia, a rabbit for Isabel, chosen based on the preferences they had shown during his hospital visits. Isabel's eyes widened, and even Sofia couldn't hide her surprise. "This is all for us?" she asked, her voice small. "All of it," Michael confirmed. "This is your home now." "Our home." That first night established a pattern that would continue in the weeks and months that followed. Michael prepared dinner simple but nutritious, as he was still learning to cook for more than just himself. Sofia insisted on helping, standing on a chair to reach the counter, her serious expression as she stirred the pasta sauce reminding Michael again that she had been forced to grow up too quickly. Isabel set the table, carefully arranging the mismatched plates and utensils with a precision that suggested she found comfort in order. At bedtime, Michael read them a story, watched as Sofia checked under both beds, and in the closet a routine he didn't question, and left the nightlight on as he wished them good night. Hours later, he was awakened by a small voice. Isabel stood in his doorway, tears on her face. "I had a bad dream," she whispered. Michael sat up, fully alert. "Do you want to talk about it?" She shook her head, clutching her rabbit tightly. "Would you like to sleep in here tonight?" He offered, a nod, and then a hesitation. "Sofia too?" "Of course." Isabel disappeared briefly, returning with a still half-asleep Sofia, who tried to look annoyed, but couldn't quite hide her relief at the invitation. Michael made room, and the girls settled between him and the wall, Isabel curled against Sofia, Sofia maintaining the slightest distance from Michael, close enough for security, but far enough to preserve her independence. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't easy. But as Michael listened to their breathing even out into sleep, he knew with absolute certainty that these 2 resilient, complicated, wonderful girls was what he had been meant to find that cold winter night. The road ahead would be long and often difficult. There would be nightmares, tantrums, setbacks, and the slow, painful process of healing. There would be questions about their past that he might never be able to answer, hurts he couldn't erase, fears he could only help them face one day at a time. But there would also be first smiles, tentative hugs that grew more confident, small triumphs celebrated together, and the gradual building of trust, the foundation of the family they were becoming. Michael closed his eyes, his heart full. Whatever challenges tomorrow brought, they would face them together. That was what families did. The Denver courthouse stood bathed in afternoon sunlight, its glass surfaces reflecting the blue Colorado sky like mirrors. Elena Rodriguez walked down the steps, the press conference behind her, her statement given, her duty for now fulfilled. A reporter called out one final question as she descended. Judge Rodriguez, do you feel justice was truly served today? Elena paused, considering. The system that had protected men like Kevin Marshall for years remained largely intact. One conviction, however significant, could not undo decades of institutional protection, of accountability denied, of power abused. Justice isn't an endpoint, she replied finally. It's a journey. Today was one step on that journey, an important one. But the work continues across the country, in a Chicago park filled with the sounds of children playing. Michael Ramirez sat on a bench watching Sofia and Isabel on the swings. 6 months had passed since that fateful night in the alley. 6 months of challenges, adjustments, heartaches, and joys. Sofia, still serious beyond her years, but now allowing herself moments of childhood delight, pumped her legs to swing higher. Isabel, gradually emerging from her sister's shadow, called for Michael to watch as she jumped from her swing into the sand. "Dad, did you see how far I went?" The word still felt new, precious, a gift Michael hadn't expected to receive so soon. The first time Isabel had called him Dad, 3 weeks ago at breakfast, he had nearly spilled his coffee in surprise. Sofia had yet to use the term, still calling him Michael with careful precision, but her trust showed in other ways and questions asked, confidences shared in the slow relaxation of her vigilance. The adoption paperwork was proceeding, slower than Michael would have liked, but steadily advancing. His apartment, once barely adequate for one, had become the home he had always wanted, but never realized he was missing. His job, adjusted to accommodate his new responsibilities, now felt like part of a life rather than the center of it. And Rebecca, that chapter had closed. The ring she had returned remained in its box, a reminder of plans changed and paths diverged. There was sadness there, but no regret. Some choices, though painful, were still right. These two stories, Elena's fight for accountability and Michael's journey into unexpected fatherhood, might seem unconnected. One dramatic and public, played out on national news. The other quiet and personal, unfolding in the privacy of an ordinary home, yet both speak to the same fundamental truth, that change begins with individual choices, with moments of courage, with the decision to stand firm, even when the easier path lies in stepping aside. Elena chose to demand justice when the system resisted it. Michael chose to open his heart and home when confronted with children in need. Different circumstances, different challenges, but the same essential willingness to act rather than merely witness. In a world where problems often seem too large to solve, where systemic issues feel immovable and hope sometimes falters, these stories remind us that progress comes not from grand gestures or revolutionary acts alone, but from the cumulative effect of individual choices made with conviction. Justice, like family, is built one day at a time through actions taken, principles defended, promises kept. Through the recognition that while we cannot change everything, we can change something. And that something, however small it might seem, can make all the difference to those whose lives we touch. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the park, Sofia called from the top of the slide, "Michael, watch this." And he did, with his full attention, understanding that this too was a form of justice, the justice of giving children back their childhood, of ensuring that those who had been unseen were now fully witnessed in all their complexity and possibility. For Elena and for Michael, for Sofia and Isabel, and for all those whose stories continue beyond these pages, the journey goes on. The work remains. But in the choices they've made and continue to make each day, we find reason to believe that change, however slow and imperfect, is always possible. All it takes is the courage to begin.